He was about to stride onto that stage, fully anticipating that the gravitational pull of his presence alone would be enough to warp the entire room to his will. He expected to command it, to own it, to consume its oxygen with the sheer force of his being. The cavernous Phoenix Convention Center seemed to hum, not with sound, but with a raw, kinetic energy. It vibrated with a tension so peculiar, so specific, that it felt alien in the space. This was not the joyous, anticipatory buzz that precedes a major concert, nor was it the coiled, aggressive energy of a championship title match. This was an altogether different frequency of human emotion, something strained and purified into a sharp, crystalline point. Every conversation was a conspiracy, conducted in tight, urgent whispers, words swallowed by the oppressive silence between them. Camera operators, seasoned professionals who had seen it all, performed obsessive, last-second checks on their lenses, their hands betraying a tremor they would never admit to. High-level political advisors, men and women accustomed to being the architects of chaos, were now its prisoners, glued to their phones, not for information, but for a sign, any sign, of a coming break or an impending breakdown. They were waiting for the first crack in the dam. Backstage, sequestered from the mounting pressure, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett was an island of stillness in a sea of anxiety. She sat alone in a sterile, impersonal green room, a space so devoid of character it might have been a doctor's waiting room or a holding cell. But she was not waiting. She was preparing. Her tailored blazer, a deep cerulean blue, was perfectly pressed, its lines sharp and definite. Her makeup was a subtle armor, meticulously applied not for vanity, but for war. A smooth, unreadable facade against the glare of the lights and the scrutiny of millions. Her posture was an unwavering line of discipline, a physical manifestation of her resolve. Yet one small detail betrayed the immense pressure of the moment. Her fingers, elegant and long, were curled with an almost imperceptible tightness around the edges of a worn manila folder resting on her knees. The folder itself was not thick, containing perhaps 30 pages, no more, but it was heavy. It felt impossibly heavy in her lap, weighted not with paper, but with the lives it contained, with stories of ruin and resilience that were the very reason she was here. She allowed her gaze to drift to the large television monitor mounted on the opposite wall. On its screen, a major news network was running a live, pulsing countdown graphic. The bold red numerals seemed to throb in time with the frantic pulse in the building. Town hall debate starting in 3 minutes. Each second that ticked away felt like a hammer blow, marking the inexorable approach of a moment that would change everything. Across the sprawling backstage complex, separated by a labyrinth of corridors and curtains, Trump had just made his grand entrance. He did not simply arrive. He erupted into the space, announcing his presence in his unmistakable signature style. There was the loud, booming laughter that was more a declaration of dominance than an expression of mirth. There were the vigorous, bone-crushing handshakes for a parade of local dignitaries and party officials, whose names he clearly didn't know, his eyes already scanning past them for the next camera or the next sycophant. And, inevitably, there was the loud, theatrical complaint, delivered to no one in particular, about the punishing intensity of the Arizona stage lights, as if the sun itself had conspired against him. His team, a disorganized and anxious cluster of aides and advisors, followed in his turbulent wake. Some of them scurried and jostled, striving to appear essential, to catch his eye, to prove their worth. Others, the more experienced ones, were engaged in a more delicate dance, merely trying to remain invisible, to avoid the unpredictable lightning of his temper. The chaotic energy of his entourage was a stark, almost violent contrast to the scene in Jasmine's room. Inside her door, the atmosphere felt degrees cooler, preternaturally calm, the air still and silent as a held breath. The distant roar of his arrival was a muffled, impotent thing, unable to penetrate the sanctuary she had built around herself with sheer force of will. "Ready?" The voice belonged to Darla Fields, her campaign manager, who had slipped inside with the quiet efficiency of a ghost, the heavy door clicking shut behind her with a sound of profound finality. Jasmine looked up from the folder. Her eyes, a deep, lucid brown, were clear and startlingly direct. There was no fear in them, only a focus that was absolute. "Darla," she said, her voice even and smooth, "I've been ready for this my whole life." The words hung in the air, simple and unadorned, yet carrying the weight of a lifetime of conviction. Darla, a woman who lived on a diet of stress and lukewarm coffee, gave a short, sharp nod, her own anxiety a stark counterpoint to Jasmine's composure. She closed the remaining gap in the door, her movements precise, as if sealing them off from the world outside. "Are you absolutely certain you want to take it there tonight?" she asked, her voice lowered to a conspiratorial whisper, the question heavy with unspoken warnings. She meant the folder. They both knew it. Jasmine didn't reply immediately. Her answer was not in words, but in a slow, deliberate action. Her fingers, which had been clutching the folder's edge, now began to trace the worn, frayed seam of its spine. It was a tender, almost reverent gesture, as if she were touching something sacred. "People have forgotten what he did," she said at last, her voice soft but imbued with an astonishing clarity. It was a voice that could cut through noise without ever having to be raised. "They've moved on. The news cycles changed. The outrage faded. But the ones who lived it," she continued, her gaze dropping back to the folder in her lap, "they never got the chance to forget. They were never given that luxury. They just had to carry it every single day." Darla let out a slow, shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was a sound of resignation, of fear, of a reluctant trust in the woman she had dedicated the last 4 years of her life to. "Okay," she said, her professionalism reasserting itself. "Okay, we have 90 minutes to get through, 90 minutes of hell. Keep your mic close to your mouth, project, and whatever you do, don't let him drag you into the mud with him. He'll try to make it a brawl. Don't give him the satisfaction." A faint, fleeting smile touched the corners of Jasmine's lips, a tiny spark of light in the solemnity of her expression. It was a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, but it held a confidence that was more powerful than any boast. "He can have the mud, Darla," she said, her voice acquiring a new, harder edge. "I brought the receipts." She gave the folder a final, decisive pat, a gesture of conclusion. The argument was over. The decision was made. Darla just nodded again, her throat too tight for words, and moved to stand by the door, a sentinel guarding the final moments of calm before the storm. Out in the main hall, under the brilliant glare of the television lights, nearly 1,000 seats were occupied, a cross-section of a nation holding its breath. Phoenix had produced a varied, restless audience, a microcosm of the country's deep divisions. There were older voters, their faces etched with a lifetime of worry, who still got their news from the nightly television broadcasts, their loyalty to certain networks as ingrained as their faith. There were young, fiery activists, their faces illuminated by the glow of their smartphones as they documented their lives and their politics on live streams, their digital native status making them both participants and chroniclers of the event. Seated near them were stoic small business owners in crisp polo shirts, their arms crossed, their expressions skeptical. And scattered throughout were retirees, their silver hair catching the light, some of whom were clutching hand-drawn, slightly crooked homemade signs with slogans of support and defiance. The air was thick with 1,000 different hopes and fears, a volatile mixture of patriotism and anger. At precisely 8 p.m., a hush fell as the host, a veteran journalist with a face known to millions, stepped to the central podium. "Good evening, Arizona," he began, his voice a familiar, calming baritone. "And welcome to our National Town Hall, broadcast live from coast to coast. Tonight, we have a critical conversation with President Donald Trump and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett." The applause was immediate, a thunderous, bipartisan roar that shook the foundations of the hall. Yet it was clear the sound was composed of two distinct, warring factions. Trump emerged first from stage right, basking in the noise. He came out with a broad, toothy wave and a confident double thumbs up, a practiced piece of political theater. He was a showman, and this was his stage. Jasmine followed a moment later from stage left, and the contrast could not have been more stark. She was calm, self-possessed, her stride measured and deliberate. She offered not a wave, but a single respectful nod to the crowd, an acknowledgement that was both dignified and distant. As she settled in behind her sleek, modern podium, she performed a small, significant ritual. She placed the worn manila folder on the polished surface in front of her. She laid it down with the care one might use for a fragile, priceless artifact. Then she folded her hands next to it. She didn't look at it. Not yet. The moderator's voice cut through the lingering applause, explaining the rules of engagement for the evening. 90 minutes of discussion, alternating responses to each question, and no shouting over one another. At that last part, a collective and knowing ripple went through the audience. Trump, true to form, theatrically rolled his eyes, a smirk playing on his lips as he glanced toward his vocal supporters in the front rows. They rewarded him instantly with a wave of appreciative laughter and cheers. He was signaling that rules were for other people. Jasmine remained utterly impassive, her face a mask of serene neutrality. Her gaze did not linger on her opponent. Instead, it swept slowly, deliberately, across the faces in the audience, from the front row to the back, meeting the eyes of the young activist, the weary retiree, the skeptical business owner. She was seeing them. She was remembering why she was here. "Congresswoman Crockett," the moderator began, his tone shifting to one of formal inquiry as the applause finally died completely. "We'll start the questioning with you." 1,000 people leaned forward in their seats. Millions more leaned toward their screens. A profound silence descended upon the hall, the kind of silence that is full of noise. "Looking at the state of our country today," he continued, "what do you identify as the single most significant failure in our nation's current economic framework?" Jasmine's posture didn't change. She didn't flinch. She took one slow, centering breath, the microphone picking up the faint, almost inaudible sound. She let her gaze rest on the moderator for a moment before turning it back toward the vast, anonymous darkness of the crowd. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was perfectly steady, clear as a bell, and devoid of any tremor. It carried through the immense space with an authority that seemed to come from a place of deep, unshakable certainty. "Economic failure," she began, "doesn't start with a bad jobs report or a dip in the stock market.